All right, thank you for watching the first video on this channel. And I'll admit I came in with kind of a clickbaity title. So if you're thinking like, here we go again, another anti-woke rant from somebody secretly obsessed with Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, then let me stop you right there. Because this is not that. This is not a takedown from below, not one of those angry reactionary rants against everything that just smells vaguely progressive. Because you see that a lot online from people like Douglas Murray or Ben Shapiro, also on the Joe Rogan Experience. You can see it a lot. But what I'm trying to do here is a bit different. You could call it critique from above. And what do I mean by that? Well, critique from above is that you actually understand, maybe even embody the thing you're criticizing, that you take the values and intentions behind a movement seriously, that you can recognize that something like the woke movement is rooted in ideals like equality, social justice, and the recognition of marginalized voices. And those ideals matter. But what happens when those ideals go too far? Or when they become so sacred that you're no longer allowed to question them? And that's the tension I want to explore here. Because we live in a time where public debate is getting more and more sensitive and more polarized. Think of topics like racism, gender identity, of course, the Israeli Palestinian conflict, or figures like Trump. And these days, it's not enough to just have an opinion. People expect you to take a side loudly and clearly. And not just from the left, but also from the right. And I feel this personally all the time. So, for example, when I try to explain or try to figure out why so many people voted on Trump, I'm accused of being too soft on him. But on the other hand, when I do speak out, when I say Trump is dangerous for democracy and I support minority rights, suddenly I'm just another woke leftist. And when I try to explore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, I find that like super interesting thing that's going on, not only there but also like the discussion in our society. Um, it's interesting to for me to understand what's driving both sides, but then I get accused of excusing genocide or from the other hand minimizing anti-Semitism. But what I'm actually trying to do is create space for the full picture, for the complexity, and for the human stories on both sides. And the same thing happens in like conversations around trans people. Like if I try to think carefully about how society can support both biological reality and lived experience, I get told I'm either contributing to violence against trans people or that I've been brainwashed by some neo-Marxist ideology. It's like we're constantly being pushed to pick a side. Like, are you for or are you against? Are you in camp A or camp B? Are you on the left? Are you on the right? And if you try to add nuance or hold multiple perspectives at once, it starts to look like betrayal. But here's the thing. There are ways of thinking that make space for complexity. And in developmental psychology, there are models that suggest the ability to hold multiple, even contradictory perspectives is actually a sign of psychological growth. Think of models like spiral dynamics or Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development theory. You also have Robert Kegan, who has the theory of subject-object shifts. And these models suggest that human consciousness develops in stages. And the further you progress, the more you're able to handle complexity, reason morally, and take multiple perspectives into account. Like, these models also show that it's only at later stages that we move beyond black and white thinking and start reasoning from universal principles rather than peer pressure or group loyalty. What all these frameworks have in common is this: they treat the ability to hold complexity not as indecisiveness or a weakness, but as a sign of maturity, of psychological adulthood. The ability to suspend judgment, to let contradictions exist without immediately trying to fix or flatten them. And maybe most importantly, to find better, more human responses without falling into endless relativism or analysis paralysis. So here's the question I want to explore. Should I take a stand against Israel because it's seen as an oppressor? Or against Hamas because it's a terrorist organization that threatens democratic values? Or is there a way to approach this conflict that lets us be critical of Israeli policies and still honor the pain and fear and history of both Jews and Palestinians? Can you condemn Trump as a divisive leader and still keep an open mind about why so many people support him without dismissing them as stupid or racist? Can you affirm and protect trans women in society and still leave room for discussion about biological differences, for example, in sports, healthcare, or concerns some women have about safety in public spaces, without immediately being labeled as transphobic? In a time where we're constantly being pressured to take a side, to judge quickly, or to join a camp, I want to ask a different question. Should I take a stand against Israel, Trump, racism, transphobia? Or is there another way to take a stand? One that does justice to complexity and to what it means to be human? So let's start with a simple question. What do we actually mean when we say someone should take a stand? Because it often sounds obvious, but if we dig a little deeper, that call to take a stand turns out to be not so simple at all. Because what does it really mean to take a moral position? Is it just about stating your opinion, or is there something more complex going on underneath? Is it purely a matter of justice and compassion or different principles like that? Or does it also have to do with different things like peer pressure, wanting to belong, or a fear of being excluded? And to what extent does your own psychological development play a role? The development those models described, I was just talking about. They described like, from what inner perspective are you actually looking at the issue? Through what lens or through what filter? Taking a stand isn't just one simple action. It happens on multiple layers at once. So we have a normative layer, where the question is, what is morally right? We have a social layer, where group dynamics and social codes come into play. And a psychological layer, which concerns how we internally deal with complexity. So this threefold lens helps us understand that taking a stand is a much more complex process than simply choosing the right side of history or standing up to the left wing moral elite and saying like it is. So let's start with that first layer, the normative one, about what is morally right or wrong. When we take a stand, we're essentially making a moral judgment. What is good, what is bad. But that's easier said than done, because what counts as good depends heavily on the ethical framework you use. And there are many different schools of thought in ethics. So just to name a few, we have deontology, and this is duty-based ethics. And think of philosophers like Immanuel Kant. He was a deontologist. And according to this view, you must always act according to fixed moral principles, regardless of the consequences. For example, you may never intentionally kill innocent civilians, even if that would yield strategic military gains. Because then you're just using people as a means to an end, and that is simply wrong. You often hear this logic in pro-Palestinian demonstrations, condemning Israel for civilian casualties. Then you have utilitarianism. And this school of thought does look at outcomes. What leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people? If an action brings more overall well-being than harm, it can be morally justified, even if it causes some damage along the way. For example, if Israel uses military force, a utilitarian might ask, will this lead to more safety in the long run for most people? And if the answer is yes, it could be morally defensible despite civilian casualties. And this kind of thinking shows up on the pro-Israel side. Like Hamas must be stopped at all costs. And also the saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, fits in this school of thought. Then you have existential ethics inspired by Sartre. It basically says there is no objective morality. You choose how to respond to what life throws at you, and you're responsible for that choice. Even silence is a choice. And if you witness the suffering of others and say nothing, you bear responsibility. You can't hide behind complexity or your role or your group. And this reflects also the pro-Palestinian rhetoric accusing European countries, but also America, like Western countries, of complicity in genocide because of the inaction. Also, the slogan, silence is violence, from Black Lives Matter fits here as well. So there's not just one way to reason morally. One school looks at rules, the other one at consequences, another at character, and yet another at responsibility. That diversity of perspectives makes moral judgment anything but simple. So now the second layer, the social one, about who you belong to. Like, moral positioning isn't something you do in a vacuum. It happens in a context of a group. The group you live in, the society you live in. And we want to belong. We want to be taken seriously and not to be cast out. It has to do with survival. And so, especially in a polarized debate, what you say is also a signal. Like, look, I'm one of your group. I'm on the right side. And you have this sociologist, American sociologist, Jonathan Haidt, and he describes this very well in his book, The Righteous Mind. He shows that we often don't make moral judgments based on reasoning, but on intuition. We feel what's right, or our group feels what's right, and then come up with rational arguments afterwards. It looks like rational thinking, but we're mostly just being loyal to our tribe. That's why nuance can feel like betrayal. And that's why you get punished for expressing sympathy for the wrong side. A quick example, like from the right, you often hear criticism that the left pretends to be morally outraged, but it's just virtue signaling. And you see that all the time on social media. Put a Palestinian flag in your bio, and people know, like, you're on that side. Say nothing, and it might be seen as support for the oppressor. Well, defend Israel's right to exist in progressive circles, and you'll likely face backlash. Do the same in conservative circles, and it's seen as a moral duty. So taking a stand is also a social act. It's not just about principles. Like, status, loyalty, and group pressure are deeply intertwined. And then there's the third layer, uh, perhaps the most fundamental one, and that's the psychological layer. This is about your inner development. From what level of consciousness are you looking at a moral issue? Through what lens or what prism? So in models from developmental psychology, like the ones from Robert Kegan, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, or spiral dynamics, morality is seen as something that evolves with your psychological growth. At more conventional stages, like the conformist stage in Robert Kegan's model, or spiral dynamics stage blue, you think in absolutes. This is right and that is wrong. And your group is the good one and the other one is seen as bad. Black and white thinking feels natural, even necessary. But at more post-conventional stages, like Kegan's autonomous stage or spiral dynamics stage yellow, you can hold paradox. You can see shades of gray. Multiple perspectives can be true at the same time. Taking a stand becomes less about choosing sides and more about honoring the bigger picture, even when that's uncomfortable. For example, someone at a conventional level might quickly choose a side in the Israel-Gaza conflict, pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. The other side becomes then the enemy, that side becomes demonized. But someone further along developmentally might say, I see suffering on both sides. I want to critically examine Israel's policies without being anti-Semitic, and I want to defend Palestinian rights without justifying Hamas's violence. And that takes psychological resilience. You have to be able to sit with discomfort, to accept that you might not have a clear-cut judgment. So, back to the question, what does it mean to take a stand? Well, it can operate on multiple levels at the same time. A normative level, like it's a moral judgment based on ethical principles. Social, it's a signal of loyalty and belonging. And psychological, it reflects how you internally deal with complexity. And as this shows, there's more involved than having the best or the most rational argument. In fact, any side can be rationally argued, like the Palestinian side and also the Israeli side. And this is exactly what Jonathan Haidt describes in The Righteous Mind. We form our opinions first and then justify them afterwards. And especially with sensitive issues like Israel and Gaza, taking a stand is anything but straightforward. It's rarely just like, are you for or are you against? It demands much more. And handling that complexity, it doesn't come naturally. It requires practice, awareness, maybe even a certain maturity in how you think and feel. So if that ability to deal with complexity only emerges later in our development, and that we should practice it, like why would we even bother? Why would we make the effort to move beyond black and white thinking? So what's the upside in making space for a plurality of perspectives in the public debate without drifting off into vagueness or paralyzing relativism? So we live in a time where moral, social, and political issues are almost never simple. Think about topics like climate change, migration, identity, Israel-Gaza that I called before. These issues touch on deeply held values and emotions, and everyone sees them differently. And yet, public debate is often framed in black and white terms, like us versus them, right or wrong. Like there's just one way you could see this right, and everyone else is wrong. People try to reduce it to something simple. Like you see with Gaza, people saying it's just genocide, we need to stop. It's that simple. And regarding like migrants, you see a group saying like we should just send them back. End of story. And this shows how hard it is for many of us to deal with complexity. But what do we mean with handling complexity? Well, it means being able to hold multiple perspectives, values, and truths at the same time without becoming confused, overly relativistic, or resorting to oversimplification. It's a difference between healthy doubt and paralyzing doubt, between nuance and vagueness. So, concretely, it means things like this: recognizing conflicting values without immediately choosing one at the expense of the other. And many public debates involve a clash between two values that are both legitimate. Like, think about religious freedom versus equal treatment. Like, we want to respect religious traditions, but also stand up for equal rights, for example, around gender and sexuality. Or sustainability versus economic security. Like, climate policy is necessary, but it also affects people economically. And people who cannot sit with that tension often rush to take sides morally without truly engaging with that complexity. But it is crucial to let those conflicting values coexist for a moment. Handling complexity also means listening to uncomfortable perspectives and also take them seriously. Take the feminist debate, where there's rightful attention to inequality and violence against women, but at the same time, more and more men don't feel valued in society. They say they struggle with like loneliness and mental health. And to some feminists, this may feel that the conversation is being hijacked. But still, those other voices also matter. And not to undermine feminist concerns, but to broaden the conversation. What do both men and women need in order to live well? What it also means to handle complexity is tolerating tension and uncertainty without falling back on your group or moral certainties. Again, to that feminist, like, let's say you're identifying strongly with feminism, and then you hear men talk about the lack of support or meaning they have in their lives. That may clash with the dominant narrative that men are mostly privileged. The reflex might be like, come on, like, men already have enough privilege and advantages. But if you can let that tension exist for a moment, you might say both can be true. Men can also be a vulnerable group in society. And even my group may have some blind spots. And it takes something to stay open, especially when it feels uncomfortable. So, why is it important to cultivate this ability to handle complexity in public debate? Well, here I can give you 5 reasons. The first one is because social issues are inherently complex. Topics like climate change, migration, war, or inequality, those affect many people. And all those people, they think very differently. They have different interests and different values. And without recognizing this layered reality, we make poor decisions, sometimes deeply unjust ones. Black and white thinking, like thinking in oppressor versus oppressed, makes us blind to the real tension between groups. Second reason, because oversimplification leads to polarization and moralization. We often crave fast and clear-cut answers. But that fuels tribalism, like the right versus wrong, us versus them thinking. And this becomes painfully clear in conflicts like Israel-Gaza. Anyone trying to introduce nuance is quickly suspected. Are you anti-Semitic, or are you now justifying genocide? And it makes the conversation toxic and unsafe. And when people feel morally judged or shut out, it backfires. They retreat, get angrier, more radical. And we've seen this in movements like Trumpism in the US or the rise of the AfD in Germany. Many people feel in those groups, they feel unseen, unheard, and they end up turning their backs on the system entirely. And then the third reason is because democracy thrives on difference and dialogue. A healthy democracy depends on the ability to tolerate difference, different perspectives, different values, different interests. And we live in a shared society with widely diverse worldviews and needs. And when we're willing to listen across those differences and stay open to one another, we keep the public space free, open, and inclusive. And without that, certain voices get just shut out. And that's a threat to democracy itself. And then the fourth reason is because human experience is complex by nature. Humans we're not simple creatures. We have layers, contradictions, difficult life experiences. And when public discourse only allows for simple narratives or catchy slogans, we exclude much of that rich, messy human reality. And that doesn't just make the debate less honest, it makes it also less human. And then the last reason is because it keeps us from becoming morally self-righteous. If you only ever compare yourself to the good group or the correct opinion, there's a risk of feeling morally superior. But those who can tolerate complexity and also stay self-critical, they see that moral purity is rarely simple. And even within progressive movements, things can quickly go wrong. Take parts of the LGBTQ plus movement, but also radical feminists, climate activism, or also the pro-Palestinian groups. All of them promote valuable ideas like equality, inclusion, and empathy. But when those ideals harden into moral absolutism, leaving no room for doubt or dissent, openness gets lost. And then we get the opposite of what we're aiming for. People no longer dare to speak up, they feel judged, silenced, cancelled, or ashamed. And they just leave the conversation. And what we then end up with isn't pluralism, it's just a new form of orthodoxy. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. So, in short, the ability to handle complexity isn't just a useful skill, it's a fundamental condition for healthy public discourse. Without it, we oversimplify serious problems or exclude people and either paralyze or polarize the conversation. At the same time, it's not something that comes naturally. It takes empathy, practice, and a certain level of psychological development. And that's what I want to explore now. Why are some people better at dealing with complexity than others? And what does developmental psychology say about that? So we've now spent quite some time on why it is important to be able to handle complexity in the public debate. But then the question remains, how do we actually learn that? Like, is it something that you can learn at school? Or is it about intelligence? Or is there something deeper involved? Developmental psychologists, they have interesting ideas about this. They show that people develop not only physically or cognitively, but also morally and relationally. So the last one is how you see yourself in relation to others, but also how do you deal with conflict and how you learn to handle things that aren't black and white, but that are layered. So what if us versus them thinking, the need for clear-cut positions, or the inability to nuance isn't simply due to stupidity or unwillingness, but just part of a certain developmental stage? And more importantly, what if you can grow out of it? Just like you can learn to walk or to do math, You can also learn to handle moral complexity. And there are various psychological models that describe this growth process well. Like I called them before, Robert Kegan's model of adult development, Suzanne Cook-Greuter's ego development model, and also the value systems of spiral dynamics. They differ in language and approach, but they share one important thing. They all assume that people grow in how they understand the world and how they relate to it. And very important is that no stage is better than another. Like a child in grade 5 is not less valuable than a high school student just because the latter can handle more complex math, for example. It's about each stage building logically on the previous one and growth being possible if the conditions allow. So let's start with that first model of Robert Kegan. He's a Harvard professor and also an authority on adult development. Describes personal growth as a shift from what he calls subject to object. And what he means is things that used to be automatic for you, things you think from, you can eventually step back and observe. For example, a young child is their anger. Angry is everything. But an adult has anger, but is not defined by it. They can notice the emotion and choose how to respond to it. Another example is a child looks at a book with a red front cover and a green back cover. And you're sitting on the opposite side and you see the green side. Yet the child think you also see red because they cannot yet imagine someone perceiving something different. The child is their perspective. Only later do they learn what they see is one perspective and someone else can see it differently without being wrong. And that's exactly the mechanism Kegan applies to how we deal with values, beliefs, and group norms. He asks, can you see your own norms, group identity, and moral compass as just one out of many ways to view the world? Or are you still completely fused with them? According to Kegan, people go through 5 developmental phases. And the first phase is impulsive consciousness. And this mostly occurs between the ages 2 and 6. You're fully fused with your impulses and feelings. And if you feel something, you are that feeling. Like there is no distance between the I and the feeling. And others exist mainly in functions of your need to comfort you and give you something or stop you. You act from moment to moment without the awareness of long-term or the other as an independent person. And then comes phase 2, instrumental consciousness, often between the age of 7 and 14 years old. But many adults partly remain here. And you discover others have wishes and goals too, but mainly in relation to yourself. You learn, if I do this, I get that. And thinking in exchange and self-interest. Right and wrong resolve around what's in it for me. You do consider others, but mainly because of your benefit. Strategic thinking arises, but there is still little empathy or moral reflection. Phase 3 is called socialized consciousness, and it often occurs from age 12, but many adults stay in this phase. And your self-image depends strongly on what your environment thinks of you. You feel at home in a we and derive safety from it. Group norms are important, like what we think is right. And a dissenting opinion within the group quickly feels like betrayal. You see this a lot in Orthodox religion. And then you get phase 4, self-authoring consciousness. And this comes later. Only a minority of people are in this phase. And you develop your own inner compass, separate from your group. You make choices based on principles, but not group pressure anymore. You think independently and take responsibility for your beliefs, but you often see your framework as the truth. And then you have phase 5, the self-transforming consciousness. It's reached by a small minority only, and you see your perspective as temporary and limited. You can hold multiple frameworks or perspectives simultaneously. You become comfortable with complexity, paradox, but also doubt. You seek integration, not certainty. Like, how do we hold tension without resolving them? And this last phase is very important because only here real space arises to bear complexity. Not because everything is relative, but because you see multiple truths can coexist, and that this is very powerful. You don't have to solve everything or reduce it to one simple answer. You can remain standing in discomfort. And that makes a world of difference in how we talk about sensitive topics. So that was Robert Kegan. Then we have Suzanne Cook-Greuter's model. And she was a PhD student of Robert Kegan at Harvard. And she builds on earlier ego developmental models. But this is one with like the most refined descriptions of the post-conventional development stages. She describes in this model how people develop in their understanding of themselves, others, and the world. And she focuses mainly on our ego as the inner system through which we make meaning out of our experiences. And our model shows that you can grow through different stages of this. In each stage, you see yourself, others, or right and wrong in a slightly different way. This development progresses from fairly simple and black and white thinking to increasingly nuanced and self-reflective perspectives. And again, like, one stage is not better than the other. They build on each other, and each stage has its own value and function. So the first stage is the impulsive, and at this stage, someone is mainly driven by what they feel in the moment. There is little difference between emotion and behavior. Good is what feels pleasant, and bad is what hurts. There's no stable sense of who am I or rules yet. Then we have the second stage, which she calls the conformist stage. And here more self-awareness arises, but mainly through group identity. People feel safe when they belong. They take the norms of family, of culture, or religion as truth, and they conform to be accepted by that group. Then we have the self-aware stage. And now someone begins to see themselves as a separate person apart from a group. But this also causes insecurity because there is more introspection going on, which comes with shame and fear of failure. You become aware of how you come across to others and place a lot of value on that. And then stage number 4, the conscientious stage, comes to life. And at this stage, a strong inner compass emerges. Someone takes responsibility, has ideals, and wants to live in line with their own values, regardless of what other people think. Self-reflection deepens. Mistakes are not only painful, but also instructive to become better, to improve yourself. And then there's the 5th stage, the individualistic stage. And here space opens up for contradictions. Someone realizes there isn't just one truth, but that people can experience things differently depending on their backgrounds or situation. There is growing tolerance for gray areas and a search for authenticity and meaning. So here someone notices that their reality is more subjective and more relative. And then the sixth one, the autonomous stage, comes in. And at this stage, people think in systems and in connections. They can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, even when they conflict with each other. They also take responsibility for themselves and the larger whole. And self-reflection in this stage is deep, contextual, and focused on development. And then the seventh stage comes in, the construct aware stage. Here it becomes clear how our beliefs, identity, and even reality are shaped by language, culture, and consciousness. People at this stage realize their own thinking is always filtered through a certain lens. And that makes inner freedom arises, but also awareness of the provisional nature of every truth. And then comes the last stage, the unity aware stage. In this final stage, the separation between I and other fades. Like people experience a deep connection with everything and everyone. There is less urge to prove yourself or prove your reality. And that gives more space for peace and compassion and presence. So that was Suzanne Cook-Greuter model. And then I want to talk to you about one last model, and that's spiral dynamics. Spiral dynamics is based on the work of an American psychologist, Claire Graves. He was a student of Abraham Maslow, known for his hierarchy of needs pyramid. And Graves researched how people develop in terms of value systems and worldviews. And later on, Don Beck and Chris Cohen expanded this model into a more practical model that can be used in leadership, change processes, and social issues. And these value systems are represented by colors, each showing a way of engaging with the world. Not better or worse, but just different developmental stages that fit for what the environment asks of them. And here are those stages. It starts with beige. It stands for survival. This is the first layer. Beige is all about basic needs like food, sleep, safety. There's no really self-awareness or group identity yet. It's just purely survival. Examples are homeless people living day to day, people in war or disaster zones, fully in survival mode. Newborn babies responding to their needs, like responding to hunger or cold or pain. Beige is instinctive and it usually stays in the background but surfaces under extreme stress or trauma. And then we have purple. It's about magic and group safety. Like once the survival from beige is secured, the need for security arises. Purple focuses on safety through group belonging, ancestors, and rituals. The world is mysterious. Protection comes via magic and traditions and group loyalty. You see this in indigenous tribes, but also small villages with strong community ties. You can see this in family businesses, scouting groups with rituals, the Vikings, Norse paganism with their rites and sacrifices. And purple offers warmth and cohesion and identity, but can still feel kind of stifling for individuals. Like they have to conform to the group and they can't be a self. And that's where red comes in. Red is about strength, immediate gratification, and survival. There's no room for nuance or outside rules. It's just about, I want it, so I take it. Respect is enforced with power, bravado, and sometimes violence. You can see this in street gangs, criminal organizations, Think about like the Crips and the Bloods, but also the Italian mafia, which is focused on status and dominance. Dictators like Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Mussolini, but fascism in general. But you also have healthier forms like heroism. So red often arises in situations with little control. It gives a sense of identity and power, but it tends towards chaos and conflict without any checks and balances. And that's where blue comes in. It's about order and certainty. And they say there's just one truth and it must be protected. Good is what follows the rules, and bad is deviation from that. Loyalty, hierarchy, and also tradition, they matter a lot to them. You can see blue in nationalism, religious fundamentalists, conservative thinking, but also Orthodox Muslim communities. And blue provides stability and order, and that enables strong institutions like the democratic foundation to evolve. But it can also become rigid and dogmatic and create a us versus them mentality. And that dogmatism that leads to orange. It's about individualism, about achievement and progress. They say the world is manageable, and through logic, science, and innovation, problems can be solved. Focus is on success, effectiveness, and competition. Examples of this are the Enlightenment in Europe, tech startups, neoliberal thinking. Think about the UK's Conservative Party or the US Republican establishment. Also, they say like you are responsible for your own success. That's what you hear a lot from those parties. Orange is dynamic and ambitious, but it can slide into toxic individualism, burnouts, and also a loss of meaning. And that's where green comes in, which is all about equality and empathy. And everyone has a voice, truth is plural. We must listen to experiences, respect vulnerability, and also expose systems of oppression. And maybe you can guess examples of this are progressive movements like Extinction Rebellion, intersectional feminism, anti-racism groups like Black Lives Matters, but also academia and social sciences that are critically examining power and privilege. Green is inclusive and caring, which is good, but they can overreach into moral judgment, which what we call wokeness, or you see indecisiveness from the fear of exclusion of voices. And that's where yellow comes in, which is about systems integration and integral thinking. And yellow can see multiple perspectives at once. Not all perspectives are equal, but all perspectives have their place. It seeks how systems work together without moral rigidity. And examples of this are thinkers like Jonathan Haidt or Yuval Noah Harari. You see them analyzing social systems without oversimplification. But also Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist and the science communicator. While he was like deeply grounded in the rational thinking and scientific method from Orange, he was not limited by him. He combined scientific clarity with a deep sense of wonder, inviting people to think systematically, not just about data, but about our place in the universe. And he spoke from a worldview that transcended ideological camps, like advocating for reason and skepticism, while also recognizing the emotional, poetic, and existential dimensions of being human. His ability to hold complexity and to communicate both scientific truth and human meaning is a hallmark of yellow. And Sagan, he didn't preach certainty, but he invited inquiry across perspectives, across disciplines, and across worldviews. And that is exactly the kind of mindset we need when navigating complex public issues today. And yellow is the first level that truly handles complexity without oversimplifying or polarization. So what the models of Robert Kegan and Suzanne Cook-Greuter, but also spiral dynamics, share is the following. Handling complexity isn't a trick. It's a developmental challenge. And we have to be able to tolerate that things aren't immediately clear, that multiple truths can coexist, that you might not see the whole picture. And that's not a given. You can only think integral if you first learned logical thinking. You can only hold multiple perspectives if you developed a solid sense of self first. Like in math, you learn roots only after mastering fractions. And this means if we want the public debate to mature, we also need to look at the participants' developmental levels, not to judge, but to understand. How flexible is someone's thinking? How mature is their moral awareness? And how much ambiguity can they handle? Public debate is not just a place to exchange ideas, but a training ground for inner growth. We learn to listen, to tolerate, to switch opinions, and also to integrate. And that is badly needed because today's challenges like climate, migration, identity, and war, they require not only knowledge or morality, but people who can bear the complexity. But what if the debate doesn't invite to that? So what if you're forced to take sides like for Palestine, against Israel, against racism, against Trump, like with no room for nuance or doubt or context? Then no dialogue arises, but a kind of moral monoculture. And that's ironic because those seemingly empathetic progressive circles can block psychological growth. They claim complexity, but they don't tolerate it in practice. So the real challenge, not what you think, but how you think. Whether you dare to hold complexity, not to understand or to solve everything, but to stay present in the tension. And that's psychological adulthood. Nobody is born with a nuanced, world-centric perspective. We all start small, literally and figuratively. What we consider right and wrong, like what we find important, that grows with us. Psychological development is therefore not something that happens automatically. It only starts when we are challenged, when we dare to doubt and question ourselves and remain open to ideas that might be uncomfortable or complicated. In developmental psychology, it's often about how people make meaning of themselves or others and the world. And that way of making meaning changes over the course of life. It usually only happens when you hit a wall, when the old story no longer works. And then something happens, what they call a coherence crisis. Imagine you've always thought in terms of right versus wrong, or black and white. And then something happens, like a dilemma, an experience that no longer fits that simple picture. And then you start doubting. Like you have to rethink what you believe and why. And that confusion is uncomfortable, but it's exactly what sets psychological growth in motion. What spiral dynamics shows well is that growth rarely happens when everything is running smoothly. Psychological and cultural development mostly comes from friction, from situations where the old worldview no longer works. And that is exactly what we mean by the coherence crisis. The moment your story about the world starts to wobble. And to name a few examples, like within the spiral dynamics framework, is that the red system arose when the old tribal societies from purple were no longer enough. Those tribes were based in tradition, magic, and rituals. Like they gave connection and meaning, but they no longer worked when tribes came into conflict constantly. Like symbolism and tradition didn't keep you alive when the neighbors invaded your village. And there was a need for power, for a leader who said, we're going this way now, like we're going against those neighbors. And so red emerged, like the world of power, of territory, ego, and decisiveness. Like no more rituals to appease the spirits. It was just like who's the strongest. But also red got stuck in endless cycles of revenge, of war and oppression. Like think of places like the Middle East, where blood feuds lasted for generations. And eventually a new consciousness arose from that, the blue value system. In the form of Islam, stage blue brought order, like rules, authority that transcended the individual. Not I decide, what they said in red, but this is how it should be, because God says so, Allah says so. Religions like Islam, but also Judaism and Christianity, they grew into structures that could hold entire societies, like under shared values, a shared story. It gave people direction, meaning, and community. But also blue got stuck, especially in its rigid and oppressive forms, like when rules become more important than the people. And you saw this in Europe. It led to resistance during the Enlightenment. Like the power of the church, like absolute truths. People, they felt trapped by it. And that became the breeding ground for the Enlightenment, for stage orange. And orange is the world of reason, science, progress. And people started thinking for themselves, developing technology, determining their own path, creating democracy. Like orange brought tremendous progress, wealth, innovation, and freedom. But also orange got stuck in burnouts, alienation, and the climate crisis. Because if you only optimize for growth and profit, both people and the planet get depleted. And that's exactly where green comes in. The value system we've increasingly seen in the recent decades. It's postmodern, inclusive, and pluralistic, where orange focuses on the individual and achievement. Green believes like we're all equal and there is more than what you can measure and calculate. And Greens ask questions like, what is the human scale in this issue? Like, which voices have we ignored all this time? Or how do we create systems that allow space for empathy, vulnerability, and meaning? Green brought attention to things previously barely seen, like diversity, intersectionality, oppressive power structures. And those terms didn't just come out of nowhere. They arose from a need of correction, like something the extreme forms of stage orange no longer offered. And that need arose from very concrete problems. For example, ecological depletion caused by endless focus of growth, like think of climate change, deforestation, and the pollution. Or the idea that we as the West know better, which for years legitimized colonization and cultural superiority. But also in policy, like hierarchical, technocratic systems that make decisions without broad support, like they just pressed it down. Or like in healthcare and education, like where quality was measured by numbers, targets, and efficiency, while those sectors actually resolve around human experiences and relationships. Like Green brought a counter movement. It showed that there is such a thing as subjective truth, that human experience matters, that care, education, justice, there are more than just spreadsheets and KPIs. So we see that each phase emerges from the crisis of the previous one. When something gets stuck, space arises for something new. Spiral dynamics is therefore not only a model for individual growth, but also for cultural evolution. But, and here's the tension I want to talk about, Also, green has its shadows. Within developmental psychology, they also name it the mean green meme, an overblown form of green thinking. But you might know it better as woke. Where it started with making room for difference, you sometimes see that difference no longer gets tolerated. That a kind of moral code arises in which you can only participate if you speak the right language, uphold the right values, and also take the right positions. Criticism then gets quickly labeled as unsafe, problematic, or even inhuman. It's get demonized, and that causes something very fundamental. People start to adapt rather than develop. They keep their doubts to themselves. They say what's socially acceptable or politically correct, but no longer dare to truly explore what they think or feel. While real psychological growth starts with doubt and self exploration. We see this reflected in many current debates, like the Israel Palestine conflict. People who try to acknowledge the history and complexity are sometimes immediately labeled as complicit to genocide. Or take climate, for example. You can acknowledge the urgency of the problem, but as soon as you question certain solutions, you sometimes get labeled as a climate denier. And for example, in the transgender debate, people just mention biological differences, for example, in sports and medicine, are quickly accused of denying someone's existence. And what all these examples have in common is that the space for open inquiry and dialogue disappears. People keep quiet or socially conform out of fear of being cancelled or excluded. And that is disastrous for psychological development because growth means facing discomfort, daring to ask questions or exploring paradoxes, even when that clashes with the prevailing morality. On a collective level, this paralysis also works the same way. If a group or society gets stuck in one dominant value system, for example, in a rigid form of green, a counter reaction often emerges. People who feel unheard start to resist. Think of the rise of the alt-right, conspiracy thinking, or populism. And that is often not regression, but a frustrated reaction to a moral discourse where they don't feel seen. So, how do we get out of this? Well, Ken Wilber says something interesting about this. He sees two ways out of this. The first, and he also says it's the hardest, is that green transcends itself. That people with postmodern worldviews become aware of their own blind spots. That they don't just say everyone is equal, but also feel like not everyone is the same, and that's okay. Then space arises for real conversation across value system boundaries. The second, and according to Wilber more likely, is that people will arise with what's called a yellow consciousness, that are in stage yellow. People who can integrate multiple perspectives without moral absolutism, who aren't stuck in one camp but look where someone is in their development, what is needed to grow further. And such people are often quieter, less morally sharp or outspoken, but all the more constructive. They build bridges, create space, and invite real development. But if you stuck in a mean green meme and you ask, does that mean that we have to accept everything, even the behavior or ideas I actually oppose, like exclusion or racism? Well, take for example Trump voters. From a green perspective, they're sometimes automatically labeled as stupid, backward, or even dangerous. But that's actually quite ironic because that attitude clashes with the core green values themselves, like the values like empathy, inclusivity, and connection. So if you look at a more mature form of green, or even from a spiral dynamics yellow stage, a response to populism or radical ideas would look very different. The mean green response sounds like Trump voters are racist and xenophobes, and if you vote for Trump, you're a fascist. But also, people just need to think better, they just need to do better, or they're dumb. And what's wrong with this? Well, that attitude excludes people. It polarizes further and undermines the green values you say you stand for, like listening to others, connection, and empathy. A healthy green response might look like this: show empathy. What makes people feel so threatened that they vote for Trump? What feelings are driving them? Listen without judging immediately. Like, maybe people feel unheard by the system. Can we take that seriously without labeling them as racist or fascist right away? But also use connecting language. What concerns do we share, even if we disagree about the solutions? This asks for something different than wanting to be right. It asks for emotional maturity, understanding that your moral conviction is not automatically the standard for everyone, and acknowledging that people make very different choices based on their own situation, values, and needs, without being wrong or bad. So the question, should I take a stance, sound like you have to choose yes or no, for or against, but precisely that black and white thinking is part of the problem. It makes the conversation more superficial, increases polarization, and it obstructs both personal growth and societal progress. So yes, we do need to take a stance, but not in the way that debates often demands of us nowadays. We need to take a stance in a way that does justice to the complexity of reality and to the layered nature of human experience. Taking a stance shouldn't be an endpoint, not a moral flag planted on a mountain, but an invitation to development, to dialogue, to awareness. It's not, I know better, but this is how I see it, and I'm curious how you see it. And that requires more than nuance. It requires developmental awareness, the realization that people reason from different levels of consciousness, with different logics, sensitivities, and moral compasses. And if you don't recognize or ignore those levels, you can unintentionally block someone's growth or slam the door shut before the conversation even has begun. That's why it's important that we learn to look beyond the overshoot of pluralism, known as the mean green meme, the postmodern reflex to want to equate everything, while simultaneously harshly judging everyone who doesn't fit in. As Ken Wilber says, there are two options. Either postmodern consciousness learns to transcend itself and realizes that not everyone operates from the same developmental level, or leaders must arise who dare to bring in a more layered, constructive perspective. Leaders who value growth more than being right, and connection more than moral correctness. Growth promoting stance taking deliberately seeks that tension between clarity and complexity. You express yourself, but with context, curiosity, and humility about your own position. You don't choose an easy simplification, but neither do you opt for indifferent neutrality. And that's not simple. It asks that we dare to be visible with our own confusion as well. Ultimately, meaningful stance taking begins with yourself, not as the mouthpiece of the right morality or the good side of history, but as a human being with confusion, with questions, not less convincing, but precisely stronger, more layered, more open, more inviting. And that's exactly what we need if we want to help people, ourselves, and each other grow in a time where complexity is no exception, but the norm. If you're still here and listening, thank you so much. Make sure that you like this video, that you subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.